My name is Ilan Pappe. I am a senior lecturer in the Department of Political Science in Haifa University. I was born in Haifa. I lived most of my life here, and I have written several books on the history of the conflict, and particularly on the history of the 1948 war. I started to be interested in Middle Eastern history in general as an undergraduate in Hebrew University. And through my BA studies in the mid-1970s, I met quite a lot of Palestinian students, and from them, for the first time, I think I heard that there's another perspective of the history of Palestine altogether. And that really pushed me towards doing some more focused research as part of my academic career. And I decided to go and do it outside of Israel in order to have a perspective from outside the country. And I went to England. I went to the University of Oxford, where I did a PhD, a doctoral thesis, with an Arab supervisor. One of them was Albert Hourani, the late Albert Hourani, and another excellent supervisor, Roger Owen, who today is the director of the Center for Middle Eastern Studies in Harvard University. And through them, I also started to have a more neutral, I would say, approach to the conflict. And in Oxford, I met even more Palestinian students and colleagues. In a way, Palestinians who were more liberated to speak about their own perspective compared to those I met at the Hebrew University. And I met several Palestinian scholars, among them Edward Said and others. I began to form an idea that something of what I knew was wrong, and something of what I knew wasn't there even. And that I needed to go myself and look at the history of the place. And after consulting with my supervisors, we've decided that I would work on the 1948 history. And I started by looking at the British policy in 1948, because I thought they disliked both sides to such an extent that would probably mean that they had a more neutral position than the others on the whole situation. In fact, when I started looking at the archives, and I should say that both in Israel and in Britain, there are regulations about declassifying material. And every 30 years, the archives are declassified, are opened, which means that the archives of 1948 were open to the public, both in Israel and in Britain, and later on even in the United States, in around 1978. So when I started working, I was one of the first ones to look at documents which had been inaccessible until that time to most of the scholarly community. And I thought I would be interested in the British policy, but the more I looked at the archives, the more I was drawn into the story of 48 itself rather than to the story of the British policy. I did finish a dissertation on the British policy, which became my first book, but I really was not that interested anymore in the British policy. I suddenly realized that there was a story there of 1948, which is the formative story of both Palestinians and Israelis, which is the basis for the conflict between Israelis and Palestinians, and that as an educated Israeli who had already 1 degree from university, I knew very little about what happened in the most important year in our country's history. And ever since then, which is, let's say, the beginning of the 1980s, I have to admit, I became obsessed with 1948, because it's like, I suppose it's like an American who would go back to either 1776 or 1865 and would feel that he knew very little about that year, and that what he knew was all distorted. So it's quite a shock. It's a trauma in many ways, for whether you are a scholar or not a scholar, it doesn't matter. So what did I find that was so contradictory to what I was educated upon? I think that there were 3 major points about 1948 which for me were very crucial, and what I found totally contradicted what I learned and what I was told through the Israeli official educational system, through my service in the army, and through my general interest in history and politics. The first was that in 1948 we were brought up to believe in Israel that this was a war between a Davis and a Goliath. And because the Davis succeeded against all odds to win the 1948 war, it produced the myth of the invincible Israeli army, which meant the Israelis felt that they were Superman. And you can see how the same myth about the invincibility, the total superiority of the Israeli army affected the Israeli myth and ethos after 48. And you can see it even in the Hollywood films produced by Americans about how the Israelis are portrayed, and of course how the Arabs are portrayed because of that. So you're not only thinking that the Arabs are maybe primitive, mysterious people, they're also cowards and people who are usually have no chance of winning any kind of a battle. Now, I also remember seeing in one of the many atlases, many of the maps on the history of the conflict, that there was always this famous map of 1948. You had thick arrows coming from the Arab world and very thin, hardly discernible arrows coming from the Jewish side to enforce this idea of David and Goliath. Now, looking at the document, it was very clear that there was, at the beginning of the war, a parity in the number of soldiers on both sides. And very early on in the war, the Jews had the upper hand in terms of soldiers, ammunition, logistics, and so on. So it was one myth that we had to deal with. And for us, as Israelis, it was important, because it was not just a question whether we were superhumans or not, because there was a very normal explanation why we won the 48 war, which has nothing to do with David beating Goliath. But there was also, it was connected to the myth that Israel was under, on the eve of a second Holocaust, on the eve of extermination. It was not. And we, I say we because I learned later on that I was not the only one who worked on the issue. Benny Morris and other historians, later to be known as the new historians, worked more or less at the same time, and we all came to the same conclusions. And we found, or I found, that the leaders of the Jews in Palestine knew exactly the balance of power. So they produce an atmosphere of fear, saying that the Jews are under the threat of extermination in order to raise the mobilization, the commitment of the Jewish community in Palestine. But they knew, in actual terms, that such a danger did not exist. And again, if you think about the American public, it was very important to sell to the American public that Israel is constantly under the danger of being annihilated or exterminated, which blurs or obfuscates any American wish to look at the situation in a more balanced position. So that was the first point. This, to this, I should add, and this still belongs to the first point, that we found out, and I was the first one to find out about it, I think, that the Israeli government, or the Israeli leadership, had, prior to the war, an agreement with the strongest Arab army, the Jordanian army, to divide Palestine between the Jordanians and the Jews at the expense of the Palestinians. And because they had such a good agreement with the strongest Arab army, it meant that it even reduced more the danger from the Arab world to the young Jewish state. And that agreement to divide what used to be mandatory Palestine between the River Jordan and the Mediterranean, between the Hashemites, people who came from the Arabian Peninsula with the help of the British and created their own kingdom next to Palestine, and the Jews who came from abroad at the expense of the indigenous population, also had very far-reaching implications to my old concept of the conflict. So that was point number one. The second point, even is more important to my mind, is the whole issue of the refugee problem. How did so many Palestinians become refugees? The official Israeli narrative, the official Israeli historiography told us at schools and later on in the university and from whoever you wanted to hear, that the population of Palestine was called upon by its own leaders and by leaders from other Arab countries to leave and make way for the invading Arab armies, and with a promise to come back after the victory would be secured. This is, for me, the most fascinating and tragic part of the story. I found out that because of the way that the United Nations Partition Plan evolved, and I don't want to go into too many details, but let me just put it in three very short and clear stages, so I think it would be clear to the viewers. The United Nations offered to divide Palestine into two parts, almost I would say equal part, 50% to the Jews, 50% to the Palestinians, at the end of the British mandate, through the year 1947. The Palestinians looked at that partition as unacceptable because they viewed the Zionist presence in Palestine as much as the Algerians viewed the French presence in Algeria. And as the Algerians would not have agreed to divide Algeria into two with the French settlers, so did the Palestinians not agree to divide Palestine with the Zionist settlers. And because of that, the Jewish leadership said to itself, if the Palestinians do not accept the partition plan, we also do not have to abide by the partition plan. And they decided in around March 1948, they, meaning the Jewish leadership, that Israel, the new Jewish state, will consist not only on the 50% promised by the United Nations, but almost an additional 30% of the land. That is to say, 80% of Palestine, according to the Jewish perception, was to be the state of Israel, even before the war of 1948. In fact, if you look at the map today, the West Bank and the Gaza Strip are the 20% which Israel had decided at that time not to include in the Jewish state. Because I mentioned before the agreement they had with the Jordanian leadership, or the King Abdullah, and in return for the Jordanian agreement not to attack the Jewish state, they were promised part of Palestine, which was the West Bank of today. The Gaza Strip is something that the Jewish leadership had not yet decided whether it wants such a large part of Palestine, such a part of Palestine which has had such a large number of Palestinians in it. Nobody knew beforehand that the Egyptians would occupy it. But more or less the perception was that Gaza doesn't have to be part of Israel, it could be part of Egypt. And the West Bank, what became the West Bank, was annexed to the Jordanians as part of the agreement with the Jews prior to the 1948 war. Now in the remaining 80% of Palestine, there were 660,000 Jews and 900,000 Palestinians. Now even the most moderate Zionists would not regard such a demographic balance as the implementation of the Zionist ideal. The idea of having a Jewish state in Palestine meant having a state with a Jewish majority, if not Jewish exclusivity. And definitely if you look at the situation, it was clear that if the Jews would not move anyone out of Palestine, or out of the prospective Israel, they would be a minority within the state of Israel. And on the 10th of March 1948, the Jewish military and political command have decided to cleanse Palestine, to expel as many Palestinians as possible out of the 900,000. We don't know even today how many exactly were expelled. We know that it moved between 750,000 to 800,000, which means the vast majority of the Palestinians who were supposed to be part of the Jewish state were expelled by force by Israel. Now, Betty Morris, who is a very thorough researcher, went to Special Archives, which is in London, where the British have monitored every transaction and every broadcast that was in the air in those days, ever since 1936. And he found no proof to any such message coming in the radio. There was no television. Coming in the air, and I found no evidence for anything in writing. And in fact, we know now for sure there was no such call. There was an Israeli propaganda myth to say that the Arab leaders called upon the population to leave. And they wanted to develop this myth because they wanted to hide the fact that they have decided in March 1948 to expel the indigenous population of Palestine. Now we're talking here about 900,000 people who lived for hundreds of years, if not thousands of years, mostly in villages, in 11 towns. And when the war ends, 500 villages are destroyed, 11 towns are gone. 750,000, maybe 800,000 out of 900,000 become refugees. Their land, they own most of the land in Palestine. The land is being confiscated by the Jewish state. They have no property rights anymore, no land rights. Their houses were looted, and their careers were stopped. And it was a real human tragedy on a large scale, And the main responsibility, according to my historical research, lies with those people who decided to expel them, the Zionist leadership. So that's point number two. First and foremost, we have David Ben-Gurion, who was the chairman of the executive committee of the Jewish Agency and later the first prime minister of Israel, a very powerful man. Most of the crucial decisions have to go through him. If he had been against it, this decision would not have been carried out. But he had people who supported him. Yigal Allon and Moshe Dayan. Very young generals. We're talking about the early 20s. Generals in their early 20s. But very eager to ethnically cleanse Palestine. Israel Galili, Eliezer Kaplan, who was a kind of a finance minister. And Mr. Transfer himself, as they called him Mr. Transfer, was someone called Yosef Weitz, who was responsible for the development and settlement section in the Jewish Agency. His duty before the war was to look at the Arab territories and say which is the fertile land and which part of the Jewish Agency would take the land and so on. He had transfer committees, official committees which dealt in each region with how to execute the transfer and what to do after the transfer. If they can cause people to flee, that's the best. If they have to put people on trucks and transfer them, that's all right. If they have to massacre people in order to intimidate them into a flight, that's okay as well. I realized that, contrary to the Israeli official historiography, that there was only one massacre in Deir Yassin. I realized that there were dozens of massacres. I once remarked that even a peace-loving movement like the Quakers, had they been in such a similar situation, would have admitted to more than one massacre. It's so ridiculous that the Israelis thought that they can sort of be let off with their own official history by saying, yes, of course, one massacre did take place, which is ridiculous. I should say something about this ethnic cleansing operation. I wrote about it for the first time in 1988, 1989, and I'm rewriting now a new book about the ethnic cleansing of Palestine because I realized how little do we still know about it, the planning, the execution, and so on. Because when I started my work as an historian, I thought the whole historical truth lies within the documents, the archives, the written sort of documentation. But then I realized the people who leave behind them documented evidence are the expellers only, those who were the victorious party. They have archives, they have documents. Those who have expelled don't have documents, don't have an archive. What they have is a collective memory. And you have to talk to these people before they die. And I started talking, and I'm now involved in a huge oral history project. Very much like the Israeli government, and I'm glad they did it, were involved in a huge oral history project about what happened to the Jews in the Holocaust. And through that project, I realized how little we know about what actually happened in each village, and how exactly the command from above to cleanse Palestine became a reality on the ground. It wanted an Israel free from as many Palestinians as possible, and having as much territory of Palestine as possible. The third point, which is no less important, I think, than the other two, which contradicts the official historiography, the official narrative, is the whole story about the peace efforts after the 48 war. The Israeli official historiography is that the Israeli leaders stretched their hand and waited for the Arab side to to take the opportunity and conclude a peace treaty with Israel after the war of 1948. My own research found that actually it was the Arab side and the Palestinian side after 1948 that was willing to reach a compromise with Israel, according to United Nations guidelines, which were very simple: divide the land into two states, allow the Palestinian refugees to return to their homes, and you have to remember that most of the homes were still there in 48, and internationalize the city of Jerusalem. And in fact, the American administration at the time, President Truman's administration at the time, supported the Arab and Palestinian position, and even for a very short while exerted heavy pressure on Israel to accept what the Americans deemed at the time as a very sensible solution. And the Israelis refused to conclude a peace treaty under those terms. And then there was an election year in America, a different American administration, different American policy, and the opportunity for peace was missed, mainly because of the Israeli intransigence and extreme policies. So if I sort of lump together the 3 points of 1948, just to make it, to clarify it once more, I would say that the first myth, or the first point, has to do with the myth of the Israel being on the eve of another Holocaust in 1948, because that would justify everything else Israel would do afterwards, in the war itself and after the war. Israel was not. And in fact, there was a chance for finding a different kind of a solution to the conflict in Palestine. But it was very useful for the Israeli government and later on for the Israeli cultural systems to produce this myth of Israel being on the eve of destruction. The second is that 48 war did produce the Palestinian refugee problem, not because the Palestinian refugees fled voluntarily from Palestine, but because they were ethnically cleansed from Palestine. And the third point was that there was a chance for peace after 1948, and not because the Palestinian and the Arab side were the inflexible and refused to enter such peace negotiations, but on the contrary, because the Israelis were very happy with the results of the war, and they didn't see any need to go into negotiations which might change their or harm the achievements they had gained during the war. So that was the major revelations about 48. And I have to say and repeat it, it was not only my work. It's the work of that group called the New Historians. We're not that many, 3 or 4 Israeli historians who were working at the time, at the same time, on the same archives, reaching the same conclusions or portraying the same picture about the past.
How does the Israeli public or anybody deal with what you're suggesting?
Yeah. It was a long process of reaction, which has its ups and downs, and I will try and describe it, because we came to the public arena, if you want, or into the public consciousness in the late 1980s. So let me just describe it sort of chronologically, because it hasn't ended yet, and I don't think there is a bottom line saying this is how the public received us. The first reaction was very suspicious, and it came through the articles in the printed press, in the electronic press, and there was an attempt to just push us aside by saying these are not professional historians, they work according to their ideologies, and they are at best ignorant and at worst agents of the PLO. But this passed because the global reaction was very different, in very respectful and respected academic centers. Our books were accepted, our works were regarded as solid professional works of history. So the academic and political establishment in Israel had to review its position. And roughly, I would say, around the beginning of the Oslo process, September 1993, the attitude changed for better. In the sense that more people than before in the media, in the academia, in the educational system, not so much in the political system though, started accepting at least part of what we were saying. Maybe not the whole picture, maybe not every interpretation we gave to the facts about 1948, but the skeleton of the story, and the knowledge that we were deceived as Israelis for many years. This was very clear, and a heated debate started in the electronic media, in the printed media. It was quite public, and it's a small country. Now the debate reached its peak or was still at the highest level of public attention as long as the peace process continued, because it was very relevant to the peace process. In fact, at one point there was a huge public debate between what can be called the old historians, that is, the historians who produced the old narrative, and the new historians in Tel Aviv University, which brought more than 700 people into the debate, which in Israel, which is a small country, is a huge number of people that would bother in the evening to, instead of watching television, whatever, go and hear an historical debate. And that was a very lively debate, and I think it really, many people, even who didn't agree with us, agreed that we did something very positive to the Israeli academia and to the Israeli research.